For the past several years, I've almost exclusively read the classics. It's what I've enjoyed reading, and to be honest, I saw no reason to change. However, this year I would like to explore modern fiction. So I thought that the Goodreads Choice Awards was a good place to start. And today I just want to talk about my initial impressions, what I found to be a common thread that seems to be running through them. And I don't want to extrapolate that to modern fiction in general, as of course I haven't read everything, but at least from these 7, there was certainly a dominant theme. The first book I read was Divergent by Veronica Roth. I have been aware of this book for a while and this series. It's a young adult dystopia, which when I was in my early teens would have been, this was what I was reading. And it was quite nice just to go back to that. It's got the central dystopian elements, which are essentially the control of a minority exerted over the majority. But I couldn't buy into the logic of the world and the reasons for the overall conflict that occurred in the book. The premise didn't make sense to me. And I know that's a bit, it's young adult dystopian fiction. I don't need to go over-analysing that. But reading the explanation of why the world came to be, and then the subsequent conflict that arises later in the book, I wasn't buying that. But having said that, I did really enjoy the book. And perhaps it's in the refreshing nature of it, moving from classics to a different genre. I really enjoyed the mother-daughter relationship. I actually found myself quite attached to it. The character of 4 too. Really liked him, Tris too. And I found the initial beginnings of the relationship between Tris and 4 just great. I thought that was really funny how that plays out. So the strengths for me really were the inter-character relationships that carried the story for me. And part of what I appreciated from it was that it was just focused on the characters, focused on the relationships. And yes, there was some depth to it, particularly in terms of the maturation of identity and finding out who you are, accepting the differences that you have or the divergence that you have from the norm. That was really the central theme overall of it, and the reason that the world was structured in that way. Again, that comes back to the logic of the world, is then it was to force a point that it was set up in that manner, and then the logic appeared to be subsequent, which never really works, trying to justify something that has to take place for a different reason. But I understand why that happened. I still don't feel like it was trying to say too much. It just allowed it to take place, and as I said previously, was really strengthened by the characters. I was surprised actually by Divergent. I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did, but overall, as I said, I wasn't surprised by the modern fiction, and that all began with the second book I read, which was A Casual Vacancy by J.K. Rowling. I don't know why this was a Goodreads Choice Awards. I can only imagine it was carried by the name. In fact, the first 100 pages were so dull. I don't care about local council business in the UK at the best of times, and of that being the main plot driver for the first 100 pages, it's not okay. I'm not dealing with that. I will say that it did pick up when the second plot thread was introduced, and in a way perhaps it was meant to be, because you had this tension in the book between the wants and the worries of this wealthier, more middle-class section of the village that was the main setting, and then you had the estate, which formed the other main setting of the novel, and contrasting the problems and the issues that they both face. So you could argue that it was intended to be dull in that storyline, which focused around the local council matters. I can, if I'm being generous, argue that point, but that doesn't justify it. You just can't do that. The beginning is most important. And another aspect that suffered at the start of the book was that there were just too many characters. It's not something that's insurmountable. I mean, look at War and Peace. It can be done. It's just this wasn't dealt with in the right manner for me. And it just went on for too long, coupled with the fact that most of the characters were indistinguishable. There didn't need to be so many. Part of the reason I think for that is that J.K. Rowling is much more comfortable. And in this book as well, I think the children were much better written. But it seemed that she need to think that for every child you need to then have 2 parents. From that, giving each child 2 parents, you're tripling the amount of characters you have. I do think, going back to that as strength, was the writing of the children. I thought they were the most interesting characters. And similarly to Divergent, where we have this aspect of retaking control, establishing identity, which I think is a common thread that goes through all of these modern fiction books, that was very prominent in The Casual Vacancy. And it was the children who became the agents of change, took control of their lives, discovering identity, separating from parents, separating from peers, and finally being able to become actors rather than just passive observers or passive inhabitants of their parents' houses. This is a book that I just can't see why it was was on there beyond the name. I think that is something which came in with another one of the books, which was Harper Lee's Ghost Letter Watchman. If this weren't building off the name of Harper Lee, I don't think we've got anywhere near the traction. It's the same theme. It's Jean Louise going back to her hometown, which is a small town. There is a huge focus upon her identity and how much it differs from the small town ideals and the small town expectations that they have for a daughter to come home and care for her father. It's not just a pressure that comes from her externally, it's also one that she feels internally, as she puts her father in such reverence that she can't distinguish her morals from his. As that reaches its climax and peak confrontation, we see that the only option for her is to cut those ties and to seek her own identity. Again, one that I think was carried by its name. Although it's a fair story, I don't think it comes close to Kill a Mockingbird. Next is The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. And I don't want to sound like I'm just going on, but it's the same thing. Discovering your identity and taking control of your own life. And this came in the format of a woman who is dissatisfied and feels like her life is going nowhere, attempts to commit suicide, and rather than dying, she finds herself in a sort of limbo or purgatory, which takes a form of a library. There is a book of her regrets, and the rest of the books are the different lives that she could have led. She initially didn't have the life that she wanted to lead, as she was pressured by her father into swimming, her brother and friend into performing in a band, and then it continued even in the lives that she chosen and these sort of ideal lives that she thought she would be falling into. Again, they weren't her lives, and she found herself trying to fit to the life that she was thrust into rather than being herself. It was only when she returned to the original life, decided to take agency and to be the force of change, that she was able to not necessarily find happiness, but find satisfaction and alleviate the crushing pressure of life and the suffering that is inherent to it. I thought it did have some interesting points, such as the one that the right life is the one that we choose. I think much like a relationship. And the idea that as soon as the other person in the relationship you're with feels disappointment, they disappear, I thought was very interesting. Interesting stakes to be had in a relationship. The unfortunate thing is that this is basically Seneca. You can travel as much as you want and you think you're going on holiday to escape, but you're taking the biggest problem with you, and that is yourself. And I think that's great advice when it comes in the form of a short maxim. Did it need to be turned into a full book? Perhaps not. But Matt Haig thought it should. So here we are. I thought it was an interesting premise, but I've read Seneca. I know where this is going. That's kind of what I meant by these books which want to say too much. They fall short, because you can clearly see the ideas that they're building upon. They're ideas which have just been said more succinctly and oftentimes better. And it reminded me of something from The Count of Monte Cristo, where King Louis XVIII is writing an annotation in the book he's reading, which I believe is by Horace. And it says that he looks up with the satisfaction of someone who feels that they've achieved something by commenting on the work of others. And that's kind of what these books feel like, that they're trying to say something that's been said many times before, and they seem to think that's some kind of achievement, that they just expounded upon it and made what was a very powerful sentence I don't want to say a largely ineffective book, but I will. I kind of feel a bit bad, like I'm just dumping on modern fiction. But the next book was one that I really enjoyed, and surprisingly, that was Still Me by Jojo Moyes. I'm aware that this is the third in the trilogy. Being this my first one, being a total change, like Divergent from classics, I really liked it. I really enjoyed Still Me. I just found the writing so charming. I was a little disappointed with the end. I thought Louisa was a very well written character, really likeable. And part of the reason I enjoyed it was that I couldn't be too critical of it, because it wasn't trying to be more than just telling a story. It also felt perhaps more real because of that. I felt a lot more emotions while reading it. Although it wasn't trying to say too much, there were very interesting things that were raised out of it. I mean, on the compatibility of relationships and the importance or lack thereof of it, I thought was interesting to explore. There was again the theme of identity and to allow your secrets to flourish, and only by doing that can you really be in control of your own life, as you're not weighed down by the pressure of this secret. The next book is And the Mountains Echoed by Khaled Hosseini. The opening, let's say 100 pages, apart from the fable which is told at the start by the father to his two children, I did not find it interesting at all. I again thought that the book picked up, but to be lacking in the initial stages, it's very difficult to then appreciate the book as a whole. I also have mixed feelings about the book structure. When the new section of the book starts, you then have to almost find your feet again. Who are you with at this moment? How does it tie back into the rest of the book? Part of me wonders whether this was done intentionally, as the book is about memory. And so that aspect of memory where you have the fragments of it and try to put it together and then can build a clearer and clearer picture can perhaps be analogous to the structure of the book and the way that the chapters are set up, that is intentionally vague, and only as you kept reading could you then build up the full picture. And fair enough, I can appreciate the idea and the attempt, but I don't think the execution was perfect, which doesn't detract from it at all. It still is an interesting idea, and it can be nice to have these representations of meaning, not just within the words within the book, but within the overall structure of the book, because that is something which is very interesting to look at the different resolutions that the message of the book is conveyed. You have the word, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, and then the book as a whole. And within that, you have the actual written structure of it. Something which is much more present in poetry in terms of manipulating the form and the aesthetic of the poem on the page. So I do have an appreciation for that aspect, but I don't know, I don't think it came off, unfortunately. And I do think that detracts from my enjoyment of the book, because again, there were elements that I really did like. The idea of relinquishing burdens that was common throughout, I think, almost all of the sections of the book. I think the most powerful was perhaps the one between Madeline and Dahlia, and that whole section, particularly with Marcos and his mother. I really liked the character of his mother, and perhaps that's something that was revealed to me here in Divergent and then in And the Mountains Echoed, the mother relationships. I don't know what that says, but I found them quite moving. Finally is Truly Madly Guilty by Liane Moriarty, and I've got to say that I hated this book. I thought it was poorly structured, the characters were badly written. I mean, some of the lines in here were just not good. They held their umbrellas up like riot shields and ducked behind them like riot shields. Multiple people were paid to read this book, and that was the best that they came up with. I just can't believe that. I just can't accept that. Once you have, one sentence which is badly written, I mean offensively badly written, it just detracts from the whole thing. You can't come back from that. And it's a 460 page book, and the payoff doesn't even begin until page 260. If you are going to build up for 260 pages, it better be the most incredible payoff, but it really wasn't. And commentators on the book saying that it was full of twists and turns. Where? Can someone show me where these twists and turns were? And it was so overwritten, because every line of dialogue seemed to need to come with this bit of exposition about the character's mentality. They've been so over-described that when it comes to it, I just have no connection to the characters. And what broke my heart the most is that on the cover, Jojo Moyes is saying that it was a great book. And, where does that leave me? But again, we still see that there was a similar theme running throughout, reconciling your own identity and then taking control of your own life. It was the common thread in all of the books. Overall, it was a mixed bag. There were some that I really enjoyed. Also, I just wondered what happened to the contents pages in books, because I don't think there was one in any of the books. And in some of them, I was really desperately looking for how much longer was left of the chapter. The other question is, what are these things at the end of the book for reading groups? And I can only imagine that they're put in there as a money-making scheme. I just thought it was funny to see what the author, or most likely the publisher, what they thought were the interesting themes within the book, and just the banality of them. Sort of saying, oh, why was this setting so important? For me, I think the setting is rarely the most revealing aspect of the book, because let's face it, those settings are a canvas in which the characters paint upon, and without the characters you have nothing. So the philosophical and psychological implications of the character are, for me, the most interesting way to approach a book. Characters in classics are allowed to act. They lead the story, whereas in modern fiction, the author wants something to happen, and so the character does that. The characters are not treated with agency, which is quite ironic, considering the common thread that's running through them. And acting and writing in that manner means that the characters are often underdeveloped. That is my assessment of this modern fiction selection. I have a few more to read. Obviously Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. Got a book by Sally Rooney, Little Fires Everywhere, Margaret Atwood's new one, and Landlines. So I'll probably be reading through them at some point. If I think there's enough interesting content and more to say, I perhaps will talk about them. But yeah, that's my first foray into modern fiction. See you in the next one.